December 3rd, 2025, Washington, D.C. The United States national debt crossed $38.4 trillion. Not 38 billion, not 38 million, 38 trillion. That is 38 followed by 12 zeros. The debt increases $70,843 every single second. Not every minute, not every hour, every second. At this moment, while you read this sentence, another $212,000 was just added to the debt. In 5 years, the debt increased by $11 trillion. In 1 year, it increased by $2.23 trillion. The average American household now owes $284,914 of this debt. But some people survived debt crises. The Romans survived for 200 years after they started debasing their currency. Weimar Germany rebuilt after hyperinflation, destroyed their economy in 1923. Zimbabwe recovered after inflation reached 89.7 sextillion%. Not by pretending debt doesn't matter, not by hoping it will fix itself, by recognizing the 5-stage pattern that every debt crisis in history has followed. This wasn't random. This was stage 3 of a 5-stage pattern that destroyed every empire, every economy, every currency that tried to spend beyond its means. The Roman Empire followed it between 200 and 476 AD. Weimar Germany followed it between 1914 and 1923. Zimbabwe followed it between 2000 and 2009. And now the United States, China, Japan, the entire global financial system is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage, crisis by crisis. The 5 stages are currency debasement, debt accumulation, fiscal pressure intensification, crisis acceleration, and collapse or reset. These aren't predictions. These are mechanisms that operate identically across 2,000 years of recorded monetary history. The mathematics don't change. Human behavior doesn't change. The pattern repeats. Before I show you the 5 stages, you need to understand why debt matters more than politicians claim. Most economic textbooks tell you that government debt is different from household debt. They say governments can carry debt indefinitely because they control the currency. They say debt is just money we owe ourselves. They say inflation will erode the real value of debt over time so we can grow our way out. Every single one of these claims ignores what actually happens when debt exceeds a nation's capacity to service it. Debt isn't just a number. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow $1 trillion, you're claiming that future workers, future businesses, future economic output will be large enough and productive enough to repay that trillion plus interest. The problem is mathematics. Compound interest grows exponentially. Economic output grows linearly at best. When debt grows faster than the economy for long enough, the mathematics become impossible. The first stage, currency debasement. The first stage is currency debasement. This is when governments reduce the actual value of money while maintaining its nominal value. In ancient times, this meant reducing precious metal content in coins. In modern times, this means expanding the money supply through central bank operations. Currency debasement is the easiest way for governments to pay debts without directly taxing citizens. It transfers wealth from savers to debtors silently and invisibly. Rome demonstrated this principle with devastating clarity between 54 AD and 476 AD. When Emperor Nero took power in 54 AD, the silver denarius contained approximately 95% pure silver. Nero needed funds for military campaigns and extravagant building projects. Rather than raise taxes or cut spending, he reduced the silver content to 93%. This small reduction funded his immediate needs. It set a precedent that would destroy Rome. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, who ruled from 260 to 280 AD, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was essentially a bronze coin with silver coating. By 265 AD, when silver content reached 0.5%, prices increased 1,000% across the entire empire. The currency had lost 99.5% of its precious metal backing. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. Currency debasement didn't cause the fall alone. It destroyed the economic foundation that made the empire possible. Weimar Germany provides the second historical example, with exact numbers that remove any doubt. Germany entered World War I in 1914 with a stable mark backed by gold. The mark traded at 4.2 to the US dollar. By 1918, Germany had accumulated 156 billion marks in war debt. The government made a fatal choice. Rather than restructure the economy to pay this debt honestly, it began printing money. The inflation began gradually. In mid-1922, 320 marks traded for $1. By December 1922, 7,400 marks per dollar. By November 1923, 4,210,500,000,000 marks equaled $1. The mark had lost 99.999999% of its value in just 5 years. At the peak in November 1923, prices doubled every 24.7 hours. A loaf of bread that cost 200 marks in the morning cost 400 by evening. Workers were paid twice daily and ran immediately to spend their wages before they became worthless. The United States provides the modern example that is happening right now in December 2025. The US dollar hasn't collapsed yet. The mechanisms are identical to Rome and Weimar. In 2000, the US national debt was $5.7 trillion. In 2008, after the financial crisis, it reached $10 trillion. In 2020, after pandemic spending, it reached $27 trillion. As of December 3rd, 2025, total debt is $38.4 trillion. This represents debt accumulation of $32.7 trillion in 25 years. The debt-to-GDP ratio is 122.6%. Interest payments tell the real story. In October 2020, the United States paid $345 billion in net interest on the debt over the preceding 12 months. In October 2025, net interest reached $981 billion. Interest payments nearly tripled in 5 years. The debt grows by $6.12 billion every single day. This is $70,843 every second. Same mechanism as Rome. Same mechanism as Weimar. Different time frame. Same destination. The second stage, debt accumulation. The second stage is debt accumulation. This is when borrowing accelerates faster than economic growth. Debt accumulation follows naturally from currency debasement because debasement reduces the pain of borrowing in the short term. If you can print money or debase coins to pay debts, why not borrow more? The temptation becomes irresistible. Eventually, the debt grows so large that even debased currency cannot service it. According to the IMF's September 2025 data, total global debt is $251 trillion. This equals 235% of global GDP. Public debt is $99.2 trillion. Private debt is $151.8 trillion. When debt levels this high exist across the entire global financial system, a crisis in one major economy can cascade rapidly. The United States followed an identical pattern after the 2008 financial crisis. From 2009 to 2019, the debt increased from $10 trillion to $22 trillion. This was during the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. When times were good, debt grew by $12 trillion. Then the pandemic hit in 2020. Congress passed $6 trillion in emergency spending in less than 2 years. This brought total debt to $30 trillion by February 2022. The debt has grown by $8.4 trillion more since then, reaching $38.4 trillion. In December 2025, in fiscal year 2025, which ended September 30th, debt increased by $2.17 trillion. That is $5.95 billion per day on average. The third stage, fiscal pressure, intensification. The third stage is fiscal pressure intensification. This stage begins when interest payments start consuming a large enough portion of government revenue that other spending must be cut or taxes must be raised significantly. Neither option is politically popular. Governments typically delay the hard choices, which makes the problem worse. The United States entered stage 3 between 2020 and 2025. The clearest indicator is the explosion in interest payments. In 2020, net interest was $345 billion annually. In 2025, net interest reached $981 billion. Interest costs increased by $636 billion in just 5 years. This is a 184% increase. In fiscal year 2020, net interest consumed approximately 8% of total federal revenue. In fiscal year 25, net interest consumed approximately 13%. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest will be 13.85% of all outlays in fiscal year 2026, 14.11% in 2027, and 14.52% in 2028. Within 3 years, $1 out of every 7 spent by the federal government will be pure interest with no services or benefits provided to citizens. The fourth stage, crisis acceleration. The fourth stage is crisis acceleration. This is when markets lose confidence and begin to question whether the debt can ever be repaid. Crisis acceleration typically features rapidly rising interest rates, currency flight, and economic disruption. Zimbabwe provides the modern template with exact numbers. Zimbabwe's problems began in 2000 when President Robert Mugabe initiated land reforms that seized farms from white commercial farmers and redistributed them. Agricultural production collapsed. Rather than accept reduced spending, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began printing money. By 2006, inflation exceeded 1,000%. The government responded by printing 21 trillion Zimbabwe dollars to pay debts owed to the International Monetary Fund. This triggered the acceleration into hyperinflation. In January 2008, monthly inflation exceeded 100,000%. By May 2008, it reached 1 million percent. By July 2008, annual inflation hit 250 million%. The peak came in November 2008. Monthly inflation reached 79.6 billion%. The annual rate calculated by Johns Hopkins economist Steve Hanke reached 89.7 sextillion%. That is 89.7 followed by 21 zeros. Prices doubled every 24.7 hours, virtually identical to Weimar Germany's worst period. $1 equaled 2,621,984,228 Zimbabwe dollars. The crisis destroyed the economy. Unemployment reached 80%. GDP per capita fell by 40%. The United States has not yet entered Stage 4 crisis acceleration as of December 2025. The warning signs are visible. Global debt provides context for systemic risk. When debt levels this high exist across the entire global financial system, a crisis in one major economy can cascade rapidly. The pattern suggests the U.S. has between 5 and 15 years before crisis acceleration becomes unavoidable unless dramatic policy changes occur. The fifth stage is collapse or reset. This is the endgame. The debt can no longer be serviced. The currency loses most or all of its value. The economy contracts severely. Living standards fall dramatically. The reset takes one of three forms. First, hyperinflation destroys the currency's purchasing power, but allows debt to be repaid in worthless money. Weimar Germany chose this path. By November 1923, when the hyperinflation peaked, anyone who owed debt in marks could repay it for essentially nothing. A mortgage for 100,000 marks could be repaid with the cost of a single egg. Debtors benefited enormously. Anyone holding marks, anyone with fixed income, anyone with savings, lost everything. The government's war debt was effectively wiped out. The cost was the complete destruction of the middle class and the economic conditions that enabled the Nazi rise to power. Weimar introduced the Rentenmark backed by real assets in November 1923. It stabilized the currency within months. The damage to society and political institutions lasted decades. Second, currency abandonment forces adoption of foreign currency or commodities. Zimbabwe chose this path in 2009. After inflation reached 89.7 sextillion% and the Zimbabwe dollar became worthless, the government officially adopted the US dollar, South African rand, Botswana pula, and British pound as legal tender. This instantly stopped inflation. Prices stabilized. The economy began slow recovery. The cost was complete loss of monetary sovereignty. Zimbabwe could no longer print money to fund government operations. Third, debt default and restructuring allows governments to repudiate some or all debt. Argentina has defaulted 9 times in its history, most recently in 2020. Russia defaulted in 1998. Greece effectively defaulted in 2012 through a restructured bond exchange. Default immediately destroys access to international credit markets. It crashes the currency. It often triggers severe recession or depression. The W2 wins and who loses. Who wins in a debt crisis? First, holders of hard assets win massively. When currency collapses, when hyperinflation destroys paper wealth, when governments default on obligations, physical assets retain value because they are real. Land, buildings, factories, precious metals, commodities, equipment. These assets cannot be printed. They cannot be debased. They cannot default. Weimar Germany demonstrated this absolutely. People who owned farmland in 1918 still owned farmland in 1924 after hyperinflation destroyed the mark. Second, debtors win when inflation or hyperinflation occurs. If you borrow $1 million today and hyperinflation hits tomorrow, you can repay that million with worthless currency. Who loses? First, savers and anyone with fixed income loses everything. Pensions, bonds, savings accounts, certificates of deposit. Any asset that promises fixed payment in nominal currency terms becomes worthless when the currency collapses. Weimar Germany destroyed the middle class primarily through this mechanism. Second, wage earners who cannot negotiate frequent raises lose purchasing power rapidly. During hyperinflation, wages lag behind prices. In Weimar Germany, workers were paid twice daily by 1923. Even then, the purchasing power of wages fell faster than wages could be adjusted. Real wages collapsed by over 70% during the hyperinflation period. The pattern is clear. These 5 stages are not predictions. They are mechanisms that operate in every major debt crisis in recorded history. Rome followed them between 54 AD, when Nero began debasing the denarius, and 476 AD, when the Western Empire collapsed. That is, 422 years from first debasement to final collapse. Weimar Germany followed them between 1914, when war debt began accumulating, and 1923, when hyperinflation peaked. That is 9 years from initial debt crisis to currency collapse. Zimbabwe followed them between 2000, when economic mismanagement began, and 2009, when the currency was abandoned. That is, 9 years. The timeline varies based on the severity of mismanagement, the size and resilience of the economy, and external factors. The pattern is identical: debase the currency, accumulate debt, intensify fiscal pressure, accelerate into crisis, collapse or reset. Same mechanisms across 5 historical examples spanning 2,000 years. The United States is currently in late stage 3, transitioning toward stage 4. Debt is $38.4 trillion and growing at $6.12 billion per day. Interest costs are $981 billion annually and rising. Interest consumes 13% of federal outlays. The debt-to-GDP ratio is 122.6%, the highest since World War II. The budget deficit is $1.8 trillion annually in peacetime. The timeline, based on historical patterns, suggests this transition could occur between 2030 and 2040 if current policies continue. That gives perhaps 5 to 15 years before unavoidable crisis. The 5-stage debt destruction pattern has eliminated monetary sovereignty in Zimbabwe in 2009, destroyed the Weimar Republic leading to Nazi Germany in 1933, and collapsed the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Each time, the leaders believed they were different. They thought their economy was special. They thought their currency was protected. They were wrong, all of them. The United States is in stage 3 of 5. The September 2025 IMF report shows global debt at 235% of GDP was not just a number. This was stage 3 playing out exactly as it did in Rome, in Weimar, in Zimbabwe. The timeline, based on historical patterns, says we have 5 to 15 years before stage 4 crisis acceleration begins. And when that happens, savers lose everything. Debtors win temporarily. Holders of hard assets survive. Governments lose credibility. Currencies get reset or replaced. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition. And the pattern is screaming that the 5-stage debt crisis cycle is accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. If this showed you why debt matters more than politicians claim, if you understand now that the 5 stages operate identically across 2,000 years of history, if you see that stage 3 fiscal pressure is exactly where we are in December 2025, then the next question is, which assets survive stage 4 crisis acceleration and stage 5 collapse? Which currencies will fail first? Which assets maintained value through Weimar, through Rome, through Zimbabwe? The 5 stages tell you what happens. The specifics tell you when and how. Same debt trap across 5 empires and 3 centuries. The only question is whether you will position yourself before stage 4 acceleration hits, or whether you will wish you had after it is too late.